Welcome, friends, to At Home with Theosophy. We are exploring the book Thought Power by Annie Besant, the last 4 chapters that focus on the development and use of thought power. So far we have seen how to develop our thought power by means of concentration and meditation. And today we are going to continue with another discipline that is important in the Theosophical tradition. Meditation is an important component, service is another important component, and study is the third element or main element in the Theosophical practice. So Annie Besant says, study that does not lead to practice is barren. The old declaration still holds good. The end of philosophy is to put an end to pain. We must learn to develop and then to use our developed thought power to help those around us, the living and the so-called dead, to quicken human evolution and to hasten also our own progress. So in our next class, the final class in the series, we will see how we can use thought power to help those around us, whether alive or, as Annie Besant says, they are so-called dead because they are pretty much alive on the inner planes, and also how to use the thought power to accelerate our evolution. Why do we want to accelerate this evolution? In the Theosophical tradition, it is as an act of service. As I mentioned, this is an important element. And the idea is that the world needs help, but only those who are beyond the need of help can help in a really consequential way, let's say. Of course, we all can help to some extent people who are around, and helping to the degree of our abilities is part of the spiritual path. But when we are able to go beyond the illusion, then the means and the power to help is far greater. And that's why in the Theosophical tradition, we are interested in trying to, you can put it, attain enlightenment, or however you want to put it, because of a reason of service, not with the selfish intent of attaining heaven, nirvana, happiness, or whatever it is. So what Besant is going to focus here is on how the very act of studying can produce a transformation in us. That is one aspect of how study can be a spiritual practice. But also what she mentions here is that the study can give us tools so that we learn how to help others. So those are the two of the main objects of this discipline that we call study in the Theosophical Society. Now, as you see, Annie Besant doesn't mention here anything connected to using thought power to fulfill our desires, to try to get this or that. Because again, in the Theosophical tradition, the desires of the separate ego in us are always going to produce suffering in one way or the other. We will see this toward the end of the class today. The only way to attain peace, attain happiness, is by going beyond the cause of suffering. That is the sense of I am the separate person that has these particular desires. In modern spirituality, there is a tendency to use thought power in what is called positive thinking, which is many times selfish thinking, or is many times, just in the same way that people tend to use other powers to benefit themselves. then they approach thought power also as something to be exploited to benefit ourselves. But there is an illusion, as I mentioned, and we will see later, that pursuit of, let's say, a selfish benefit is not really a benefit. It's actually part of the reason why we suffer. So the Theosophical approach has a different take on this and several other aspects than what we often hear in modern spirituality. So remember, we saw this in the previous series and have mentioned it in this one also. The idea is that not only we have a physical body, we also have an emotional body, a mental body. They form part of what we may call the aura. And these bodies are also made of matter, not physical matter. They are made of what we may call emotional or mental matter, which is perhaps we can visualize it better as if we think in terms of energy, but it's actually material. This can be seen by clairvoyance. And because they are material, they have mechanical properties. They vibrate, they move, they generate patterns that are visible to the clairvoyant eye. So they are a body in themselves. And Annie Besant says that when the mental body vibrates under the action of thought, and I added they are true thought, because another distinction that Annie Besant made in the first part of the book is that when she talks about thinking, she's talking about the conscious, willful thinking, the one in which we as awareness are engaged, and not this thinking that is done on us, so to say. That's that thinking that happens without our real participation. We are not directing the thinking. There are thoughts that run within our minds, and that's not true thinking in the way that Annie Besant uses it here. So when we are engaged in true thinking, using our faculties of reason and inquiring and intuition, the mental body vibrates, and then fresh matter from the mental plane is drawn in from the mental atmosphere and is built into the body, which thus increases in size as well as in complexity of structure. So if you see a mental body in a soul that is beginning evolution, is small, colorless, more like a cloud, let's say. And as evolution proceeds, that mental body is enlarged. It acquires different colors that have to do with the quality of thoughts that are usual in the person. It begins to develop a very well-defined outline and what we may call mental organs, or mental or chakras on the mental body, let's say. And then all this is part of the evolution of the mental body, just like physical bodies evolve throughout time, then the mental body also evolves during the journey of the soul. And then she says, thinking, and this happens by means of true thinking, by means of our awareness engaged in trying to understand the world, understand ourselves, understand the purpose of life, because in this trying to understand, what the soul is doing is discovering connections that exist there, but that the soul was not developed enough to perceive. Mathematical facts are there, but before humanity discovered them, humanity didn't know about them. Now, when some mathematical relationship is discovered, it's not that was made up. It's simply that this was discovered by observing, the behavior of numbers, for example. So similarly, by true thinking, we start discovering connections, facts that are out there, but that we as souls were not aware. And this makes the mental body grow and develop and become more complex, etc. And she says that also the cells of the great matter of the physical brain multiply as the brain is exercised in thinking. And this is something that science knows today. Thus, both the mental body and the physical brain grow by exercise, and the inherent powers of the knower are also evolved more rapidly. So the explanations I gave so far, they belong to the bodies, to the mental body and to the physical body, the brain in particular, in this case. Now, the knower, Besant defined it as, let's call it the spirit or consciousness, working through the mental body. So our consciousness can work through the mental body, through the emotional body, through the physical body, or through higher bodies. When consciousness works through the mental body, that's what she calls the knower. And consciousness also unfolds its inherent powers when it engages in this kind of true thinking. And this true thinking is an inquiry, it's actually a form of meditation. So she says, those who would improve and enlarge them must have recourse to regular daily thinking. Of course, we think throughout the day. Who is out there that doesn't think constantly all day long? But remember that Annie Besant, by thinking, she refers to this inquiry, to living with a learning mind, not with a mind that is reverberating thoughts, but a learning mind that engages during the day in an active process of trying to understand our actions, understand the environment, the situations in our lives, or understand spiritual realities. So as an exercise, this is something that we do during the day, but as an exercise in particular, she proposes the following. Let a person choose an able book on some subject which is attractive to them, a book written by a competent author containing fresh, strong thought. A sentence or a few sentences should be read slowly, and the reader should think closely and intently over what he has read. So, see, she's saying, okay, grab a book, but there are some conditions. To use this as an exercise to strengthen your thought power, it has to be a book that is a deep book. Other kinds of books are also useful. They may give you information, they may entertain you, they may illustrate, different aspects of life. But if you are going to use this for the purposes of developing thought power, it has to be a book that has solid thought there, solid, facts and reasoning, etc. And then she says, pick a sentence or a few sentences and read them slowly. This is completely different from how we normally read. We normally read fast, many people as fast as possible, trying to cover as much of the book as possible. And again, that is fine for other purposes, but that's not how you strengthen your thought power. You choose a few sentences, you read them slowly, and then she continues, the reader should think closely and intently over what he has read. It is a good rule to think twice as long as one reads. For the object of reading is not simply to acquire new ideas, but to strengthen the thinking faculties. So you get this book, you read a paragraph, let's say, and then you stop and you try to absorb, you try to see as much as you can in that paragraph. Not just, get whatever your mind gets at first and keep on moving. You stop there. So it's a kind of meditative studying. And then you try to see what are the the what does this kind of view implies. How would I live? How would life look if I live from this point of view? What are the implications? What does this mean then in connection to this or that? If we are taught that when we incarnate, we bring the habits that we created in previous lives. Then if that is the case, what does that mean? What kind of influence the environment has on us? Because normally um, our culture that doesn't believe or take into account previous lifetimes, when they try to explain anything about why a person is the way that person is, will blame the parents and the educators, or they blame the genes, because, well, these are the two sources of shaping the personality that we can see if you only look at the one lifetime. But if we are talking about a soul that has a long past, that has qualities developed and has weaknesses that has not conquered, so then what does that mean in explaining why I am the way I am? So you see, all this kind of thinking has to take place as we study, for the purpose of developing thought power. So she says, as a rule, of course, you don't need to keep track of the time, but generally speaking, devote twice as much time to think than to reading. And that also will depend on the book. There are parts in a book where this may be an illustration, there may be not too many concepts there, and there may be not much to read, to think about, and then you come to the next paragraph, and then that is a deeper paragraph. So you may not spend a lot of time with the previous one, you may spend it with this. So be flexible with this. But if you choose the book correctly, if it is a book that has good concepts there, then you can study in this way. And in that effort at trying to perceive the realities that are behind the words, the realities that the words are only pointing to, as we talked about before, then in that effort, you as awareness unfold your inner wisdom, and also your mental body begins to develop to be sharper, more organized, more embracing, more flexible, and your brain also is impacted to be able to sustain that kind of activity. So the brain also develops. Now, here again, as we talked about this in meditation, Annie Besant says, let the student remember that for steady growth, regularity of practice is essential. Once the habit of steady thought is acquired, regularity is less important. But before this, if a day's practice is omitted, 3 or 4 days' work are necessary to counterbalance the slipping back, for the old habit of loose drifting of the mind reasserts itself, and the matter of the mental body falls back into its old shapes. So we can see these, similar processes in our daily life. When you are trying to master something or to produce a change, you see that you have to do it regularly. But once something is established, a skill, a habit, something is established, then it is not necessary, because matter has this inertia that we discussed before. So when the inertia goes in the wrong direction, you have to regularly counteract that tendency to go in the wrong direction. So it is important to do it regularly, because as soon as you stop pressing in a different direction, then the inertia will tend to go back to the previous state. Now, once you have changed that inertia, and now the inertia is going in the right direction, then you don't need to so much to keep pressing, because now the inertia is helping you. Of course, you need to keep practicing, because there is always a possibility of creating a new different direction that you don't want to go to, but it's not as necessary once it is established. So again, get a book that is deep. This book, if you read the whole book, you will see there are parts that are very deep and are not that simple to understand. Read the reviews about the book, and there are many people complaining that it's not an easy read. But if they had read the book, even though it's not an easy read, Annie Besant is telling you here, there is a purpose why this is not an easy read. These kind of books are not just to inform you or entertain you or, give you some ideas. These are the kinds of books that you can use to actually unfold your inner wisdom, to develop the latent powers. And like this, fortunately, in the Theosophical tradition, we have many deep books. Most of them are not great sellers because they are not easy to understand. But the purpose for these books were not to become bestsellers. Actually, Blavatsky, for example, dedicated The Voice of the Silence to the few. No publishing company would be happy with an author that is writing a book that will be only interesting to the few. But this, again, is something that I think makes the Theosophical tradition different from modern spirituality, which it has many good features, but tends to be also more commercial. Another important aspect in mental life is to learn to undo the habit of worrying about things. Unfortunately, the way we are raised, the way we are educated, the way life is designed, it is designed to produce worry and anxiety. And more, we as a society are beginning to suffer the effects of that. But the problem is that worry and anxiety have a very bad effect on the development of our thought power, the development of our mental body, the unfoldment of our consciousness. So it is important to exercise, and we will see what Annie Besant proposes, to practice so that we can progressively reduce the tendency to worry. So Annie Besant talks here about its meaning and eradication. So first, she defines from an occult perspective what worry is. She says, worry is the process of repeating the same train of thought over and over again with small alterations, coming to no result, and not even aiming at the reaching of a result. So that could be a psychological definition. That's actually what we experience. Something keeps coming to our minds, and we keep rethinking all that. And as Annie Besant says there, not necessarily to try to solve it. We just keep getting engaged in this anxiety or fear or uncertainty. Now, from an occult point of view, she says it is the continued reproduction of thought forms initiated by the mental body and the brain, not by the consciousness, and imposed by them on the consciousness. So here again, we need to keep in mind the theosophical model of what a human being is. Our mental body has its own life, its own kind of consciousness, its own activity, and therefore, the mental body and the brain, the automatism of the brain, they do produce thinking. This is the kind of not true thinking that Annie Besant mentions. So worry, she says, is not something that we choose, we as consciousness. It's something that is imposed on us. It's something that is being produced by the automatism of the mental body and the brain, and that consciousness is helpless and gets engaged once and again with this useless mental activity. So she says, why does this happen? The thinker or the knower, consciousness, has dwelt on a painful subject and has failed to reach a definite and useful conclusion. He ceases to think, but remains unsatisfied, wishing to find the solution and dominated by the fear of the anticipated trouble. So this is the key why the mental and the mental body and the brain do this, because we as consciousness have dwelt on a subject that is challenging, and we couldn't come to any clear view or to any closure or to any conclusion, as she says. So we stop thinking about it, but there is no resolution there. So that door that remains open, we as consciousness still remain unsatisfied that we haven't found the solution. And then that makes the mental body and the brain keep producing these thoughts. As she says, under the impulse of this energy, the mental body and brain continue to move automatically, throwing up the images already shaped and rejected. Because this is thinking that we have already seen that this is not the solution. This doesn't tell me what to do. So we rejected those points of view. But because we haven't come to any clear view, all those fragments that were rejected when we were consciously looking at the situation, they come back like, little ghosts. And we as consciousness get caught into that automatic repetition of useless thoughts that we saw are not bringing a solution. So Besant explained why is this the case. When a thought current has made for itself a channel, a thought form, new thoughts currents tend to flow along the same track because that is the path of the least resistance. So if you see clairvoyantly, you can see in the mental body like patterns that are there ready to enter into activity. So when we have generated these channels or these patterns or these thought forms that remain attached to our mental body, then there is a natural tendency of our thinking to go in that direction. Because just as in physical nature, that energy tends to go through the path of least resistance, the same happens psychologically. So she says, the tendency of the mental body and the brain, released from immediate work, is to let unemployed energy flow into the channel already made. So while we are busy, we may not be worrying because the mental body and the brain are busy there. But as soon as we are not paying attention to anything else, then the natural energy that is there in our bodies, in our mental bodies, then they start going through that channel, which is the worry. Now she says this very automatism of the mental body and the brain, this tendency to repeat vibrations already produced, may be used to correct the useless repetition of thoughts that cause pain. Perhaps the best way to get rid of a worry channel is to dig another of an exactly opposite character by definite, persistent, regular thought. So just as we have generated that worry channel, then now what we have to do is to open a new channel, but this has to be done in a persistent way, regularly. As we explained, we are trying to generate a new shape in the mental body that has a different tendency. The thinking has to be definite, as she says, in the sense of well-defined, not vague wishes for goodness or vague wishes for, to be peaceful or at ease, because vague thinking doesn't really generate a clear impression on the mental body. So it has to be, as she says, definite, persistent, regular thinking of a character that is the opposite to the worry. And in that way, you begin to diminish the worry. You will still worry, but little by little you worry less. Then you come to neutralize it. And then you actually begin to see that when your mind and your mental body are not at work, they now tend to go to think about, spiritual things or positive thinking and emotion, etc. By positive thinking, again, I mean things spiritually inclined. So by using this quality of the mental body to generate a channel, a pattern, we can undo the ones that are not, healthy. So here is how you can do it. She says, let then a person who is suffering from worry give 3 or 4 minutes in the morning. You see, it's not a lot. You don't need to start with half an hour if that is difficult for you. Just start with 3, 4, 5 minutes, but do it every morning. And she proposes the morning. She says on first rising, because at that point you can catch your mind. You can give your mind an impulse in the right direction instead of trying to work with your mind once your mind began to move in the opposite direction. So, give 3 or 4 minutes in the morning on first rising to some noble and encouraging thought. So if this is a question about worry and fear, you can repeat to yourself, the self is peace, that self am I. The self is strength, that self am I. So these are, as I mentioned, affirmations which I would call spiritual affirmations, which are trying to help you realize your true nature. Now, the affirmation per se is not enough. I mean, if you repeat something constantly, you may get a kind of conditioning on your mind, but the conditioning is always superficial. So that's not what we are seeking. We are not seeking to condition the mind, even if it is in the right direction. What we are seeking is to elicit our inner wisdom, is to open the door for a true insight. So you have to engage in this true thinking, not merely repeating it. You have to engage in this definite, persistent, regular thinking. And this is what she says next. She says, let the person think how in his innermost nature he is one with the Supreme Father, how in that nature he is undying, unchanging, fearless, free, serene, strong. So you repeat this affirmation, and then you try to understand my real nature, what I really am. Once this body, life gets rid of this body, and I come back to my true nature, I am all of this. I am undying. I am unchanging in essence, and we are eternal in essence. There is no fear. There is nothing to be afraid of if you are eternal, if you are beyond the possibility of being hurt, let's say. We are free, we are serene, because all the troubles are troubles that come because of our identification with the body that is none of this, the body that will die, the body that is constantly changing and getting sick or creating aches, etc. A body that has all this instinct for self-preservation and this tendency to be afraid. It is imprinted in the instinct of the body. It's not fearless. It's not free. The body is very limited and it's not serene. So in this little meditation, we have to try to get a grasp of our true nature. And then she continues, think of that and think of how we who are eternal are clothed in these perishable vestures like the physical body, that those are the ones that feel the sting of pain, the knowing of anxiety, and think about that. All this is really coming from the body. It's not coming from me. The fear does not belong to my true nature. Fear belongs to the body. But what happens when the body is afraid? Then I assume I am afraid. And this is what she says next. Think of how he mistakenly regards these things that come from the body as himself. So you see, it's a little meditation. You use the affirmation as a foundation. You try to feel what the affirmation means, and you engage in trying to reframe what your idea of who you really are is. So you do this every day, 5 minutes or less, and you will see how this little by little counteracts the tendency to worry. She says, as he thus broods, peace will enfold him. Eventually, when you start regularly doing this, at the beginning, you may not experience anything. It may even feel that all your thinking is artificial because you still feel anxious. You don't feel the reality that you are eternal or undying. But it doesn't matter. You start putting your attention there, and then peace will enfold you. And then you will feel that peace as being your own, your natural atmosphere. Little by little, because of this effort of our consciousness to see our true nature, then we will begin to get in touch with our true nature. And then little by little, these moments of peace will come. And as they come, we begin to identify ourselves with them. We begin to realize this is what I really am and not the fear. Day by day, she says, thought will dig its own channel in the mental body and in the brain, and ere long, when the mind is loosed from labor, the thought of the self, that is peace and strength, will present itself unbidden. So that's what I was mentioning, that then little by little, the habit of the mind becomes thinking of the self instead of thinking of the worry. Now, to develop this thought power, perhaps paradoxically, there is something more that is necessary. That is to develop the ability not to think, to develop the ability to stay in silence. So there is this section, thinking and ceasing to think. And she says, much gain of strength may be made by learning both to think and to cease thinking at will. While we are thinking, we should throw our whole mind into the thought and think our best. So she says here that, try not to engage in that kind of superficial thinking where you are thinking of 2 or 3 things at the same time, and you lose track of your thinking, halfway because you were thinking also of something else. All that is not good for all these effects that we are seeking, unfolding your powers in your awareness, reshaping the mental body, etc. If you are going to think about something, think about that, pause whatever you are doing, focus on that, think about that properly, with all your attention, and then you drop it, and then you think of something else. Try to avoid, I know that, our modern life kind of pushes us to multitasking, but you can multitask one task at a time. So when you have to deal with this, you let go of all the other things, and then once you are done with that, even if it is, a few seconds, 20 seconds, then you let that go and you focus on the next thing. Actually, I just read a report from a scientific journal that says that when people are frequently distracted when they are working, that produces a constant generation of the stress hormones, and that obviously is unhealthy. So they are beginning to try to think how to reframe our work environment, because that distraction has an unhealthy effect. And why would that be the case? Well, it is related to this. If we cannot pay our whole attention to what we are doing at the time, and we are constantly shifting our attention, that has an effect on the mental body that makes the mental body like looser, and that is translated into the activity of our brain and the function of our bodies. So she says, when you are thinking, think with the whole of your minds. But when the work of thought is over, it should be dropped completely and not allowed to drift on vaguely, touching the mind and leaving it like a boat knocking itself against the rock. Many times we are done with something and the thoughts keep coming and keep coming and keep coming. So again, that's a tendency of the mind and the mental body and the brain, that they have the tendency to keep producing these thoughts. But we can train our mental body, we can train our brain to drop things and to let them go. And this is a training in detachment, in a sense. This is a training in learning to die from moment to moment, as Krishnamurti would say, in the sense of learning to let go. When we don't let go, then that attitude is impressed in all of our bodies. So we finished thinking something or talking to somebody, and then we can't just move on to the next thing. Then there is a lingering thinking, rehashing, what was said, etc. So this is natural in the sense that the mind has that tendency, but after all, evolution in the Theosophical view is to be able to go beyond what is natural, to become supernatural in a sense, to be able to have mastery over the tendencies of nature in this case as matter, the tendencies of the material aspect in ourselves. So she says, when we think about something, then you move on, try to train yourself to drop it. And if the thought comes into your mind, you become aware of that thought, and then you drop it and you focus your attention on the next task. And for some time you may have to do this several times, but try to avoid engaging, opening the door for these lingering thoughts. You recognize them. It's not that you repress them, you say, this is terrible, or I am terrible at this. This is all natural, but you recognize it and you said, I'm not going to engage, and you focus on what is in front of you right now. Now she says, to learn to cease thinking, to let the mind rest, is an acquisition of the greatest value. A person may preserve both mental body and brain longer by learning to cease thinking when thought is not being directed to useful result. So this is what I was mentioning, that this constant thinking and interruptions and superficial activity, it wears out the body, both physical and mental. So learning how to drop thinking when thinking is not needed and falling back in a state of silent awareness is very important. Now she recognizes, she acknowledges, it is true that ceasing to think is by no means an easy achievement. And perhaps it is even more difficult than thinking. It must be practiced for very brief periods of times, until the habit is established. For it means at first an expenditure of force in holding the mind still. So I think we mentioned this. You would think that, for example, physically, what generates an effort is when we have to move, to use our muscles, and then sitting and resting and relaxing doesn't need any effort. So you would think that the same is the case at the mental level, but that is not really the case. Even physically, many people cannot really relax. They have to make an effort to relax, which seems an oxymoron, but it's true. Mentally, at the beginning, to be quiet, we have to make an effort. And sometimes it is far more effort, it implies far more effort than thinking about something difficult. And the reason is that, again, we are not the thinkers. We as consciousness can induce the mental body to think, but the mental body has its own tendency, as we said. So when the mental body has this tendency to think, before you are able to rest in non-thinking, you have to spend energy in holding the mind, in teaching the mental body to stay at rest. So it's like you are holding it, and in that holding, you are spending energy. This is why meditation is difficult. If for you meditation is just sitting and letting your mind do whatever it does, then that may feel very relaxing and nice. But if you use meditation as a training, you immediately realize that it's difficult, that it requires effort, that it normally requires more energy than you have. The experience in meditation for most people is, I just can't keep my mind quiet. And that, again, is normal. As Annie Besant explained, we saw it in the previous class, we have been stimulating the mind to be restless for millions of years. So it's no wonder that the mind will have a strong tendency in that direction. So at the beginning, sometimes there is this idea in spirituality to rest in an effortless state. And paradoxically, at the beginning, you have to make effort to get to a state of non-effort. But eventually, as your effort with a regular practice succeeds, you will discover little by little that now staying in silence and in quietude is not something that requires effort. On the contrary, when silence begins to be available to you without having to apply effort, you begin to discover how refreshing silence is, how resting, how in a sense, invigorating silence is. But as Annie Besant says here, at the beginning, don't overdo it. Try to stay in quiet silence without letting thoughts come, and engage with the thoughts, just for brief periods of time. Maybe at the end of your meditation, as you finish your practice of meditation, even if it is this 5-minute practice in which you repeat this affirmation, you think about your true nature, you think about the fact that you are identified with tendencies of your bodies, what you are not, essentially. And after that, maybe try to stay in silence, like absorbing the atmosphere of that understanding that came from your inquiry, and just try to stay in silence for 30 seconds or less than that. Start with whatever you can start. And then little by little, you will develop the ability to stay in silence for longer. So She gives an example of how you can do this in meditation. She says, let the student, when he has been thinking steadily, after your inquiry, as I explained, drop the thought, and as any thought appears in the mind, turn the attention away from it. So this is not a question of repression. It's just do not get engaged with the thoughts that appear. If you don't engage with the thoughts, then you will see that the thoughts as they appear, they leave. There are different ways in which you can practice this. With a pure silent awareness, you let the thoughts come and go, and you don't get engaged, and that is a technique. Although in general, it requires that you have already developed the ability to position yourself in this unengaged awareness, which is not always the case. For most people, this requires a previous practice. So another way of doing it is by choosing what to focus on and not engaging with all these other thoughts. We saw this in the chapters on concentration. You choose an object of concentration, you place your attention there, and you don't engage with these secondary thoughts. But if you are trying to stay in quiet and silence, not focus on an image that is there in your mind, if you want to be in a state of awareness with no images in your mind, what can you do? Annie Besant says, persistently turn away from each intruder, each thought. If need be, imagine a void as a step to quiescence. As an intermediate step, imagine a void and try to be conscious only of stillness and darkness. So this is not quite dwelling in silence because you have an image in your mind, but it's an image of nothingness. So this helps you transition from focusing your mind on something to learning to rest with no thoughts in your mind. So she says, imagine a void, dark, boundless, and focus your mind on that void. And a thought comes, you notice it, and then focus again on this void, this, the divine darkness, as Pseudo Dionysius would say, a Christian mystic. So she says, practice on these lines will become more and more intelligible if persisted in. As you practice, you will realize how to do this, what this means. And a sense of quiet and peace will encourage the student to persist. So eventually you won't need the help of this non-image, and then you will begin to be able to dwell in just the quiet, peaceful awareness that is left when the mental body is not producing thoughts. And she continues, nor should it be forgotten that the cessation of thought is a necessary preliminary to work on the higher planes. When the brain has learned to be quiescent, when it no longer restlessly throws up the broken images of past activities, then the possibility opens of the withdrawal of consciousness from its physical vesture. So this is what yoga means. Yoga in the way that Patanjali defines it, not the yoga of the asanas or breathing exercises or visualizations. Patanjali, as Annie Besant quotes later, defines yoga as the cessation of mental activity, basically, the cessation of the modifications of the mind. That cessation in Sanskrit is nirodha. Nirodha is when the mind is not moving. And this is yoga, learning to stop the mind, not by means of any trick, but simply by letting the mind be quiet. And as she says, it is only once the mind is able to do that, that our consciousness can leave the body, not leave the body to do, an astral journey, some, astral projection. You can do astral projection without any of this, but you are still working within the realm of the same kind of mind. You may do astral projection, but have the same level of ignorance, the same level of anxiety, the same level of, whatever it is. What Besant is talking about here is consciousness leaving the physical body to awaken on the higher nature, on the spiritual realms, not the psychic realms of the astral plane, for example. So before that is possible, you must learn to stop thinking, to let the brain and the mental body be quiet. Those who hope to take this forward step within the present life must learn to cease thinking. For only when the modifications of the thinking principle, this is the quote to Patanjali, are checked on the lower plane, can freedom on the higher be obtained. This is not an easy achievement, but this is part of what is there as we proceed on this path. And then the last section, the secret of peace of mind. She says, all our troubles arise from thinking of ourselves as separate units. This sentence is very deep. If you are studying this book on your own with the purpose of developing your thought power and unfolding your consciousness, this is a good sentence to stop and see what the implications are. All troubles arise from thinking of ourselves as separate units. We normally think that our troubles arise because I have a bad neighbor, because I don't have a good relationship with my family, because I don't have enough money, or I don't have this or that. But Annie Besant is saying that all troubles arise from thinking ourselves as separate units. What does it mean? Do I recognize how much I think I am this person that is obviously different and separate from anything and everything around me? So you see, you stop and you try to absorb the whole import of these kind of sentences. So she says, all troubles arise from thinking of ourselves as separate units and then revolving on our mental axis, thinking only of our separate interests, our separate aims, our separate joys and sorrows. So she's saying even, the seeking of joy and happiness, as long as I am seeking joy and happiness from the perspective that I am a separate unit, that will result in sorrow. So the pursuit of happiness by any means that are based on the idea that I am a separate individual will not result in happiness. It will result in sorrow. So whether you are doing it by trying to, attain material goods and goals to be successful, or using your thought power to get whatever you think you need to be happy, or to practice meditation so that you attain, your nirvana. All those things are simply not going to be effective to produce peace, to produce joy. So this is part of what Annie Besant is saying, that as I mentioned, we need to spend time thinking about this. This is what she proposes when using study as a spiritual practice. She says, some do this seeking, separate or personal aims. Some do this as regards the lower things of life, possessions, money, etc. Of course, you need a certain level of possessions, a certain level of money, etc. We are not going to the extreme of saying you cannot be spiritual if you have things, or we are talking about, what your in your pursuit of happiness, what is it that you are pursuing? How are you pursuing your happiness, and whether that will be, effective or not? So some people do this as regards to the lower things of life, and they are the most dissatisfied of all, ever restlessly snatching at the general stock of material goods and piling up useless treasures. But others seek ever their own separate progress in the higher life, good, earnest people, but ever discontented and anxious. They are ever contemplating and analyzing themselves. Am I getting on? Do I know more than I did last year? And so on. Fretting for continual assurances of progress, their thoughts centered on their own inner gain. So you see that focus on our spiritual growth, our how far am I from happiness or from this or that, that in itself is the source of suffering. Even if we are very well intentioned, very spiritual, the very way in which we approach this is the source of suffering. She says, peace is not to be found in the continual seeking for the gratification of the separate self, even though the gratification be of the higher kind. It is found in renouncing the separate self, in resting on the self that is one, the self that is manifesting at every stage of evolution, and in our own stage as much as in every other, and the self that is content in all. So as we are less identified with the separate aspect of myself, that is the physical body, the emotional body, the mental bodies, these are all individual bodies, separate from the rest. But this is not what I am. These are the vehicles that what I really am is using to express itself. Now, what I really am, what each one of you are, is the one self. And we can experience each one of us being the one self when we can raise our consciousness to our true nature. Then we realize there are not many selves. There are many expressions of the one self. I am not this particular expression. I am the one self. Only as that becomes first very vaguely as an intuition, little by little, we begin to feel this, only to the degree that we start getting in touch with that, we begin to be more peaceful, more contented, less anxious, regardless of how many possessions we have, regardless of how, well this is going or not on the external plane. So she says, desire for spiritual progress is of great value, so long as the lower desires entangle and fetter the aspirant. So sure, it is better to desire for enlightenment, spiritual things, etc., than desires for more selfish and more material things. So the spiritual desire helps us gain strength to free ourselves from those lower desires by the passionate longing for spiritual growth. And to that extent, it is useful. But that desire for growth does not and cannot give happiness. So do not expect that you will attain happiness by means of spiritual ambition, let's say. It may help you get rid of lower desires. It will not give you happiness because, again, the source of unhappiness, happiness is your true nature. The only reason why you are not happy is because you think you are something that you are not. You, me, everybody. So as long as we do anything based on that wrong idea, we will remain in the realm of suffering. It is only when we realize our true nature that we realize our true nature, the quality of our true nature is happiness. The less I think I am something that I am not, the less I suffer, because the more I realize my true nature is happiness. So she says, the more we desire, the more the craving for happiness, which in itself is unhappiness. If you are very focused on reaching happiness, you are constantly unhappy. You are painfully aware that you are not happy. So the more we desire, the more the craving must grow. The secret of peace is the knowledge of the self, and the thought, that self am I, will help towards the gaining of peace of mind that nothing can disturb.